Somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, around 1200 BC, a merchant ship is being loaded under torchlight. Copper ingots from Cyprus, stacked in the shape of stretched animal hides, each one worth a fortune. Tin from somewhere far to the east travelled through a dozen hands before reaching this harbour. Amphorae of olive oil, bolts of dyed cloth, jars of resinated wine. The sailors speak different languages, but they know the trade routes by heart. They know the ports, the seasonal winds, the going rate for grain. They've done this 100 times. They'll do it 100 more. Except they won't, because within a few decades nearly every port they know will be silent. The cities behind those harbours will be rubble. The palaces that commissioned the cargo will be ash. And nobody knows exactly why. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. One of the most dramatic and still most mysterious events in all of human history. A moment when not one civilization, not two, but an entire interconnected world of powerful, sophisticated, literate societies came apart at roughly the same time. Around 1177 BC, give or take a generation, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a catastrophe so profound that it would take some regions centuries to recover. Others never quite did. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly what I make these for. So before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely read them. There's something I find deeply strange and wonderful about the fact that someone in Tokyo might be hearing this at dawn, while someone in Toronto is hearing the same words just before midnight. Tell me where you are. It matters more than you might think, and I'll explain why by the end. Now, what exactly collapsed? Because that word gets thrown around a lot, and it's worth being precise, because the scale of what happened here is genuinely staggering. We're not talking about one kingdom losing a war and a new dynasty taking over. We're not talking about an economic recession or a rough century. We're talking about the disappearance of entire ways of life, palace systems that had administered complex societies for centuries, gone. Long-distance trade networks that spanned thousands of miles, severed. Writing systems that had recorded everything from tax receipts to royal correspondence, abandoned. Whole cities, some of them among the largest and most sophisticated urban centres on Earth at the time, burned, abandoned, or simply never rebuilt. In some places, the population appears to have collapsed alongside the institutions. The archaeological record goes from dense urban occupation to scattered rural villages, or nothing at all, within the span of a few generations. This is what historians mean when they talk about collapse in the ancient world. Not just political change, not just a change in who sits on the throne. A systemic unravelling. The kind where all the things that make a complex society function, centralised government, specialist labour, written administration, organised trade, military security, stop working more or less at once. And here's the thing that makes this particular collapse so haunting. It wasn't one civilization. The Mycenaean Greeks, whose palace centres had dominated the Aegean for centuries, collapsed. The Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful states in the ancient world, a rival to Egypt itself, vanished almost overnight. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was burned and never reoccupied. Cities across Canaan and the Levant were destroyed. Cyprus, which had built enormous wealth on copper production and maritime trade, saw its major centres go dark. Even Egypt, mighty Egypt which managed to survive the crisis, emerged from it weakened, contracted, and fundamentally changed, a shadow of what it had been. All of this happened within roughly the same 50 to 100 year window. In historical terms, that's almost simultaneous, and it raises a question that has genuinely haunted scholars for generations. How does an entire system fail at once? How do civilizations that don't share a border, that speak different languages, worship different gods, organize their societies in different ways, all come apart at the same moment? The suspects are real, and there are several of them. Climate change and prolonged drought have left chemical signatures in ancient pollen records and sea sediments. Famine is documented in desperate letters found in the ruins. A mysterious group known as the Sea Peoples appears in Egyptian texts, and may have swept through the region like a wave of migration and conflict. Local rebellions against palace economies that had grown too extractive and too rigid might have cracked the system from within. Earthquakes struck some of the key sites. Trade routes, already under strain, may have entered a catastrophic feedback loop where each disruption made the next one worse. None of these explanations on its own quite fits everything. The drought doesn't explain every city. The Sea Peoples don't explain the inland collapses. The earthquakes are real but too scattered to account for the full picture. And that's precisely what makes this one of the most intellectually fascinating puzzles in all of archaeology and ancient history. Because the answer, to the extent we have one, seems to be all of them, interacting with each other, amplifying each other, in a system that had grown so interconnected and so specialized that it had also grown brittle. Think about what happens when a supply chain breaks down in the modern world. One factory in one country stops producing a single component, and suddenly car manufacturers on the other side of the planet can't finish their vehicles. Now imagine that kind of interdependence, but without phones, without satellites, without the ability to reroute in real time. Imagine it stretching across 3,000 miles of sea and desert, held together by seasonal sailing winds and the trust of merchants who knew each other by name. Then imagine something starting to go wrong, not one thing. Several things in several places, more or less at once. That is what we are going to spend tonight exploring. Not just what fell, but how. Not just who was there, but what their world actually looked like before the lights went out. And maybe, quietly, what it means that the most sophisticated civilization the ancient Mediterranean had ever built turned out to be one good crisis away from silence. Settle in. The story starts about 3,000 years ago on a warm evening in a world that had no idea what was coming. To understand what collapsed, you first have to understand what existed. And what existed around 1200 BC was something genuinely remarkable. Something that had no real precedent in human history and wouldn't be matched again for a very long time. Historians sometimes call it the Club of Great Powers. It's an apt phrase, a little wry, a little formal, and it captures something real about how the major states of the Late Bronze Age actually related to each other. Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Kingdom of Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia, Kassite Babylonia to the south, and Assyria, the kingdoms of Cyprus and the Aegean. These were not just neighbours, they were something closer to diplomatic partners, bound together by an elaborate system of correspondence, gift exchange, and royal marriage that the ruling classes of the ancient world had developed into something approaching an art form. We know this because we have the letters. Hundreds of them baked clay tablets inscribed in Aegean, which functioned as the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, the way French did in 18th century Europe. Found at sites like Tel El Amarna in Egypt, they show us kings addressing each other as brothers, negotiating the exchange of gold and lapis lazuli, complaining when shipments arrived short of what was promised, requesting physicians, requesting craftsmen, requesting brides. There's a tone to these letters that feels almost modern in its mix of high ceremony and naked self-interest. Pharaoh writes to the king of Babylon that he has sent 40 gold vessels. The king of Babylon writes back that the vessels, when melted down, barely amounted to 20. The correspondence is simultaneously formal and petty in the most recognizable way. But beneath the royal pleasantries was something structural and serious. This gift exchange was not charity, and it was not simply luxury spending. It was diplomacy made tangible. It maintained relationships between states that might otherwise be rivals. It created obligations and expectations. It was the Bronze Age equivalent of foreign aid, trade agreements and treaty maintenance rolled into one. And it worked for a surprisingly long time, because every party in the system had something the others needed. What they needed more than almost anything else was metal, specifically tin and copper, the two components of bronze. And here is where the geography of the ancient world creates something almost miraculous in its complexity. Copper came predominantly from Cyprus, which sat in the eastern Mediterranean like a natural warehouse, and whose very name in Greek may derive from the word for copper. Tin is harder to trace. The nearest reliable sources were far to the east, in Afghanistan, or possibly in parts of Central Asia, and tin travelled extraordinary distances through multiple intermediary hands before it reached the smiths who needed it. Getting the proportions right, roughly 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, produced a metal harder and more workable than either component alone. Bronze made weapons and tools and palace fittings and ships fittings. Without it, the whole military and agricultural and administrative apparatus of these states would grind toward a halt. So the trade routes were not optional, they were foundational, and they were remarkable in their reach. Merchant ships crossed the Aegean and hugged the Anatolian coast, stopped at ports in the Levant, pushed down toward Egypt. Overland caravans moved through Syria and into Mesopotamia. Ugarit on the Syrian coast was less a city in the modern sense, and more a node, a place where the sea routes and the land routes intersected, where merchants from the Aegean rubbed shoulders with merchants from Assyria, where warehouses were perpetually full and the harbour was never quite quiet. Behind all of this commerce sat the palace economies. And this is the part that tends to surprise people who picture the ancient world as simple or improvised, because these systems were neither. The great palaces of the Mycenaean world, the Hittite administrative centres, the Egyptian royal bureaucracy, these were extraordinarily sophisticated operations. They employed scribes trained in specialised writing systems. They maintained detailed records of incoming and outgoing goods, of labour obligations, of agricultural yields, of livestock inventories. At Pylos in Greece, thousands of linear B tablets record transactions with an accounting precision that feels almost tedious in the best possible way, because it tells us just how tightly these systems tracked every jar of oil, every allocated ration, every craftsman's output. Centralised storage was the beating heart of it. The palace collected surplus from the surrounding agricultural population, stored it, and redistributed it to specialist workers, soldiers, administrators, craftsmen, people who didn't grow their own food because they were too busy doing the specialised labour the palace required. It was a system that made complexity possible. It also made everything dependent on the palace continuing to function. And this is where something important begins to emerge. All of this, the diplomatic networks, the metal trade, the merchant shipping, the palace accounting, the specialist labour, created a world of remarkable efficiency. Things got done, goods moved, information travelled. Societies supported levels of population and sophistication they could not have maintained without the network. But efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. In fact, they often trade off against each other. A system optimized to move tin from Afghanistan to Greece with minimum friction is also a system that has very little slack in it, very little redundancy, very few backup options for when something goes wrong. When every node in your network depends on every other node, a disruption anywhere starts becoming a disruption everywhere. When your palace economy requires imported tin to produce the bronze that pays your soldiers and equips your fleet and maintains the agricultural tools your food supply depends on, a break in the tin supply is not just an inconvenience. It is a crack in the foundation. The Bronze Age world had spent centuries building something intricate and astonishing, a genuine international system, long before anyone had a word for such a thing. What it had not done, perhaps could not have done, was build in a way that accounted for what would happen if that system came under pressure from multiple directions at once. It was a masterpiece of human organisation, and like a great deal of beautiful, complex things, it turned out to be more fragile than it looked. If you zoom in on this late Bronze Age network, one of the brightest, most tightly wound knots is in the Aegean. This is the world that later Greeks would remember only in stories. The age of Agamemnon and Odysseus and the walls of Troy. But the reality, as far as we can reconstruct it, is at once stranger and more mundane than the legends. We call it Mycenaean Greece, after one of its most imposing centres, Mycenae in the Argolid. But Mycenae was not alone. Picture a landscape dotted with hilltop palaces, Pylos in the southwest, Tiryns and Mycenae in the northeast, Thebes further inland, Iolcos and others whose names we know only from fragmentary references. Each commanded a surrounding territory, a patchwork of fields, villages and coastal inlets feeding resources into the palace at the centre. Unlike Egypt, we don't have grand inscriptions where kings boast about their victories in polished prose. What we do have in enormous quantities are clay tablets baked accidentally in the fires that destroyed these palaces. These are the Linear B records, written in a script that looks almost decorative at first glance, small wedges and strokes impressed into wet clay. For a long time nobody could read them. Then in the 1950s they were deciphered and revealed to be an early form of Greek. The content is not heroic, it's not myth, it's bureaucracy. At Pylos, on the western coast of the Peloponnese, about 1,000 tablets survived from the final year or two before the palace burned. They read like the Bronze Age equivalent of spreadsheets, lists of grain and oil, allocations of wool to particular weavers, records of chariot wheels, body armour and spearheads, inventories of sheep herds broken down by district. We see officials, overseers and collectors. We see ranks of specialized workers. We see priests and sanctuaries receiving offerings. The language is curt, almost telegraphic. So and so owes so much. So and so receives so much. It is not trying to impress anyone. It is trying to keep track. From these dry little notes a picture emerges. The Mycenaean palace was not just a royal residence. It was the core of a managed economy. Farmers in the countryside owed the palace a portion of their produce. This was taxation, though nobody would have used that word. Grain, olives, wine, livestock flowed inward to be stored in magazine rooms, in enormous pithoi sunk into the floors, in storerooms whose walls were blackened centuries later by the fires that consumed them. From this central surplus, the palace supported people who did not farm for themselves. Bronze workers, chariot makers, textile specialists, full-time soldiers, administrators, and probably the retinues of the royal household. Linear B tablets show us how intensely this was organized. Weavers are grouped into teams under supervisors. Wool is issued in specific amounts, finished cloth is expected back. Bronze is weighed out in measured quantities to smiths, who are supposed to return finished blades and fittings. Chariot components and armour are logged, inspected, and sometimes reassigned. In some cases we can watch a single consignment of wool pass through multiple hands, from raw fleece to spun yarn to woven cloth, each step recorded. This is not a market economy in the modern sense, with prices and open competition. It is redistribution. The palace takes in, the palace gives out, and in doing so it binds its society together. If you work for the palace, your rations, your materials, your tools, your status, all depend on those flows continuing. If you live in the surrounding countryside, the palace is both your tax collector and your emergency granary, the institution that may feed you in a bad year and conscript you or requisition your animals when war comes. For a while this system seems to have worked very well. The palaces are decorated with elaborate frescoes. They produce exquisite luxury goods, inlaid daggers, carved ivory, finely worked gold. They participate in international trade, receiving copper from Cyprus, perhaps tin from further east, exotic items like ostrich eggs and glass. Mycenaean pottery shows up in shipwrecks off the Turkish coast, in Levantine ports, even in Egypt. In the 15th and 14th centuries BC, this looks like a success story. And yet, toward the end, the tone shifts. You can see it in stone, even before you read it in clay. The great citadels grow teeth. At Mycenae and Tiryns, walls of massive, roughly fitted blocks, what later Greeks called Cyclopean, because only giants could have moved them, are extended and reinforced. New gates are added, sometimes with complex arrangements that force attackers into narrow, easily targeted spaces. Underground passages are cut through bedrock to reach hidden water sources, ensuring that the palace can withstand a siege. At Pylos, perched by the sea and perhaps feeling more secure, the fortifications are lighter, but even there defences are present. The investment in walls is an investment in fear. You do not pour that much labour into fortification unless you think someone might try to break in. The tablets begin to hint at strain as well. We see references to coastal watchposts, to men stationed in a ring along the shoreline, as if expecting trouble from the sea. Some tablets at Pylos list groups of rowers and ships by district, suggesting hurried naval mobilization. Others record unusual religious activity, large-scale offerings that some scholars think might reflect attempts to appease the gods during a crisis. There are also signs of resource pressure. Some regions show evidence of deforestation, terracing, and intensive agriculture, as if land is being pushed hard to feed a growing population and a demanding palace centre. Competition between palaces may have been sharpening. Mycenaean weapons caches grow larger. Burials with lavish warrior gear become more common. Iconography emphasizes chariots, spears, boar's tusk helmets. A society that had long been hierarchical and martial seems to lean even more into those identities. Then, very suddenly in archaeological terms, the palaces are gone. Between about 1230 and 1170 BC, destruction layers appear across mainland Greece. At Mycenae, fire sweeps through the citadel. Rooms collapse, storerooms bake, and the linear B tablets, otherwise ephemeral, harden into the only reason we can still read them. At Tiryns, parts of the palace are burned and rebuilt, then burned again. At Pylos, the palace is destroyed in a single conflagration so intense that the roof falls in and seals the final archive of tablets beneath it. The pattern is not perfectly synchronous, it ripples. Some centres fall earlier, some later, some perhaps more than once. But the trajectory is downward. The last palatial outposts flicker out. Linear B, as a living administrative script, vanishes. For a few generations there are still people at or near these sites, living amid the ruins, reusing walls, occupying parts of what had been grand complexes. Then many of these locations shrink dramatically or are abandoned entirely. Population disperses into smaller, less centralized settlements, often in more defensible or remote spots. What killed the palaces is one of those questions that refuses a simple answer. In earlier scholarship, the favourite culprit was invasion. Later Greek tradition speaks of Dorian newcomers sweeping down from the north, bringing new dialects and new ways. Some archaeologists once imagined waves of sea peoples crashing into the Aegean. There are certainly signs of violence, burned buildings, arrowheads, smashed masonry, but there is no clear, uniform layer of foreign weapons or obviously intrusive material culture that would let us point to one conquering group and say, definitively, it was them. Others point inward. A highly stratified society, dependent on tight central control, may have fractured under its own tensions. If harvests failed, if trade with Cyprus and the Levant faltered, if the palace could no longer guarantee rations to its soldiers and artisans, loyalty might have evaporated. Elites might have turned on each other. Regions might have rebelled against distant, extractive centres. Civil strife leaves the same ash and rubble as foreign invasion. Economic explanations trace the vulnerability back to those very linear B tablets. A system built on meticulous redistribution has very little shock absorption. A disruption to bronze supplies, a series of bad harvests, outbreaks of disease among draft animals, loss of a key harbour to an earthquake or rival, any of these could start a chain reaction. The palace fails to pay its specialists, the army is under-equipped, local leaders hoard resources, trust collapses. Once that happens, the central archive and the nice frescoes are liabilities, not assets. And then there is the possibility that it wasn't any single thing, but a cascade. External raids probing a weakened coast, earthquakes rattling already stressed masonry, drought tightening its grip on marginal lands, refugees moving by land and sea, straining food supplies, spreading panic stories faster than anyone can verify them. In such a scenario, the Mycenaean palaces might have been less victims of one decisive blow and more the most visible casualties of a regional system coming apart at its seams. We can read their last accounts, we can trace the soot where their roofs caved in. What we cannot do is listen in on the final councils in those megarons, when kings and scribes stared at incoming reports and tried to decide which threat mattered most. By the time the smoke cleared, the system that made those records possible was gone. And while this was happening in Greece, the same kinds of pressures were building elsewhere in the club of great powers. On the Anatolian plateau, another palace-centred empire was entering its own last decade. If you follow the trade routes northeast from Mycenaean waters, across the Aegean and into Anatolia, you hit another centre of gravity in this late Bronze Age world, the land the Hittites called Hatti. It was not, at least at first glance, an inviting place to build an empire. The Hittite heartland sat on a high, rugged plateau, with hot, dry summers, cold winters, and limited arable land. But what it lacked in easy fertility it made up for in defensibility. From their capital at Hattusa, perched among hills, ringed by massive walls laced with gates and processional ways, the Hittite kings managed one of the great imperial balancing acts of the late Bronze Age. Their system was both grand and fragile. At the core, in central Anatolia, the king and his court controlled a network of royal estates, temples, and administrative centres. Like the Mycenaeans, they pulled in agricultural surplus, livestock, and labour. But their real power lay in what radiated outward, a web of vassal states stretching across Anatolia and down into northern Syria. Some regions were ruled directly by Hittite officials. Others remained under their own dynasties, but swore loyalty to the great king, promising troops, tribute, and obedience in foreign policy. In return they received royal daughters in marriage, prestigious gifts, and, most importantly, Hittite military backing against their local rivals. On paper, this looked impressive. The Hittite king could call on armies from western Anatolia, northern Syria, even as far as the Euphrates. In treaties preserved on clay tablets, vassal rulers swore elaborate oaths, invoking dozens of gods to curse them if they broke faith. The Hittites had pioneered an international diplomacy of equals with Egypt and Babylonia, and a hierarchical diplomacy of subordination with everyone else. But that strength came with built-in fault lines. Those frontiers in western Anatolia and northern Syria were never really pacified. They were zones of constant friction, between Hittite interests and local kings, between Hittite authority and Egyptian influence, between highland raiders and lowland traders. The empire was shaped less like a solid block, and more like a patchwork quilt held together by promises and coercion. In good years, when grain flowed, when copper and tin arrived from Cyprus and beyond, when the king could move armies quickly to crush dissent, that quilt held. In bad years the seams strained. Our window into those last decades comes from the royal archives, thousands of cuneiform tablets found at Hattusa and other Hittite centres. Many belong to earlier, stronger times, but a subset from the late 13th century BC starts to sound nervous. We see letters complaining of shortages. Officials write to the king about a lack of grain, about fields that are not producing enough, about difficulty supplying troops and workers. In some texts, the crown itself petitions abroad for food. One Hittite queen, probably Puduhepa, wife of Hattusili III, writes to the pharaoh in Egypt, asking for shipments of grain to relieve famine in Hatti. Elsewhere, the king of Ugarit sends provisions, noting Hittite hunger. These are not casual favours, for a great king to admit scarcity to his peers was to reveal vulnerability. Yet the letters exist. They suggest that toward the end the Hittite core was feeling the pinch of poor harvests, possibly wider climatic stress, and perhaps the cumulative effect of overtaxed lands. Instability appears in other ways too. Late texts contain complaints about banditry and unrest in the countryside, pleas for reinforcements to keep key roads open. There are hints that some vassal princes are dragging their feet on obligations or openly playing both sides between Hatti and its rivals. The language is still formal, but beneath the courteous formulas you can feel strain. To the south, the Hittites faced Egypt, their old adversary from the days of the Battle of Kadesh. By the late 13th century, relations had stabilized into something like wary partnership, sealed by dynastic marriages. Egyptian princesses married Hittite kings, let us call the rulers brother. But the borderlands in Syria, places like Amuru and Kadesh, were still contested, and Hatti's ability to project power there depended on keeping its Anatolian supply lines intact. To the west, in Anatolia itself, the picture darkens more abruptly. Hittite sources speak of hostile groups in the northwest, often bundled under names like the Ahiyawa, a term many scholars link to Mycenaean Greeks, and local powers in Arzawa and other western regions. We hear of rebellions, defections, and campaigns to reassert control. Sometimes the great king succeeds, sometimes the record breaks off mid-effort. These frontier troubles were not new. The Hittites had been suppressing revolts for centuries. What's different at the end is the sense that the centre is losing the ability to keep up. Armies are still dispatched, but the petitions grow more urgent. Vassal kings hedge their bets. A system that depends on everyone believing the great king will always show up is exposed when he can't. And then Hattusa falls silent. Archaeologically, the capital is destroyed and abandoned around the early 12th century BC, roughly in the same broad window as the Mycenaean palace burnings. The great city with its temples and archives, its monumental gates and storerooms, goes up in flames. Its cuneiform tablets are baked hard by the same heat that consumes the buildings holding them. We can see the ash. We can see collapsed walls and charred beams. What we cannot see clearly is who exactly did it. Later Assyrian and other Near Eastern sources do not offer a neat explanation. There is no inscription boasting, I, so-and-so, destroyed Hattusa, the way some conquerors brag about other victories. Hittite texts up to the end speak of enemies, of dangerous Western peoples, of unrest in Syria, but they stop before the final blow is recorded. Scholars have proposed several overlapping culprits. Internal rebellion is one. If core regions were starving, if troops were unpaid, local elites or provincial governors might have turned on the royal centre, looting or burning it in struggles for power. In this scenario, Hattusa's end would be a civil implosion more than an external conquest. Others point to outside attackers, highland groups from the north, mobile raiders from the west. Populations sometimes loosely connected with the broader movements that Egyptian sources later call the Sea Peoples. Hattusa's location, far from the Mediterranean coast, makes a simple seaborne raid less likely, but not impossible in combination with overland allies. Once again, the evidence is suggestive, but not definitive. There is also the possibility that the final destruction was simply the last act in a slow, uneven collapse. As vassal states in Syria slipped away, as western Anatolia fragmented into independent powers, as trade routes faltered and famine bit deeper, Hattusa may have become less and less viable. Its fall might mark not the moment the empire died, but the moment the corpse stopped twitching. What is clear is that the political structure of the Hittite Great Kingdom disintegrated. The Great Kingship, with its claims over Syria and Anatolia, vanished from the diplomatic stage. The archives closed. For Egypt and Assyria, one of their main counterparts in the Club of Great Powers was simply gone. But the people were not. In the centuries after Hattusa's destruction, we see the emergence of what historians call Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian states, small kingdoms in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, Carchemish, Melid, Patina and others, that continued many Hittite traditions. They carved monumental stone reliefs in a familiar style. They used hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, a script and language closely tied to the old Hittite world. Their rulers bore titles and names that echoed earlier dynasties. They worshipped some of the same storm gods and sun deities. In some places, city walls and palaces rise again, on or near earlier Hittite foundations. Politically, these were no longer empire-spanning powers. They were regional players, squeezed between a resurgent Assyria, Aramaean groups, and other local forces. But culturally, they kept a thread of continuity alive. Hatti as a centralized state had unraveled. Hatti as a cultural tradition of law codes, rituals, artistic forms, ways of writing and ruling survived in new, smaller frames. So when we talk about the collapse of the Hittite Empire, we have to be careful. The palace system, the web of vassal treaties, the idea of a great king commanding from Hattusa, that all disappears in a generation or two. Yet in the hills and valleys of southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, people still told stories in Hittite and Luwian tongues, still invoked the old gods, still inscribed their names in scripts born in the imperial heartland. Like the Mycenaean world, Hatti did not vanish so much as change phase. The bright, centralized flame of empire went out. The embers, scattered, continued to glow. And while those embers smouldered in the north, further south, another old power was straining to hold its own against famine, migrants and mysterious enemies on the sea. Egypt, at the end of the 13th century BC, looked, on the surface, more secure than most of its neighbours. It still had a powerful royal court, massive temples, a bureaucracy that had been refining its paperwork since before the pyramids. The Nile still flooded, perhaps irregularly, perhaps less generously at times, but it had not failed outright. The great temple complexes at Karnak and Medinet Habu were still being embellished with carved reliefs. Priests still chanted hymns to Amun, Ra and Ptah. And in the international game, Egypt still mattered. Since the famous Battle of Kadesh a century earlier, Egypt and Hatti had carved out a kind of détente in Syria. The pharaoh claimed influence in southern and coastal regions. The Hittites dominated the north and inland zones. Border cities like Amurru and Ugarit lived between those spheres, manoeuvring carefully. Egyptian garrisons and officials persisted along parts of the Levantine coast, in Canaanite cities that sent tribute and letters back to the Nile. Maintaining that position was not cheap. To keep a foothold in the Levant, Egypt had to move grain, troops and goods by land and sea. Garrisons needed to be supplied. Local rulers needed gifts to keep them loyal. Envoys had to travel with caravans, scribes, guards and pack animals. In a world of tightening resources and more frequent disruptions, those overseas commitments became heavier and more fragile. By the time we reached the reign of Ramesses III, in the early 12th century BC, that strain breaks into the historical record with unusual clarity. Ramesses III, ruling from around 1184 to 1153 BC, is one of our best documented pharaohs for this period. At his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu on the west bank of Thebes, he left sprawling reliefs and long inscriptions describing his victories over enemies he names as sea peoples. For many modern readers, these scenes have become the iconic image of the crisis. In the carved panels, you see Egyptian chariots racing along the shore, archers loosing volleys, ships colliding in a chaotic naval battle. Foreign warriors appear with feathered headdresses, horned helmets, round shields, different styles of swords and spears. Some come by land with ox carts and families in tow. Others are shown on ships, clashing with Egyptian marines. The accompanying texts describe invasions from the Isles, peoples who had toppled other lands and were now turning toward Egypt. Ramesses claims that no land could stand before their arms until he, the pharaoh, intervened. He boasts of luring them into traps, smashing them on land and sea, taking prisoners, and settling some survivors within Egypt as subjects. These inscriptions are not neutral reportage. They are royal propaganda carved to glorify a king and reassure a nervous elite. But they are not pure fiction either. They are corroborated in a rough way by hints from elsewhere, letters from Ugarit mentioning enemy ships, destructions in coastal cities around the same time, mentions in Egyptian lists of foreign groups with names that seem to correspond to some of the peoples in the Medinet Habu scenes. Together, they suggest that Egypt did indeed face serious military pressure from groups arriving, at least partly, by sea. This is where the phrase sea peoples comes from. Modern scholars use it as a convenient umbrella term for a cluster of names that appear in Egyptian records of the late 13th and early 12th centuries. BC, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, Jika, Denyen, Weshesh, and others. Some of these names may correspond to later peoples in the region. Peliset is often linked to the Philistines. Shurdan have been connected, cautiously, to Sardinia, but the identifications are debated and not universally accepted. The most important thing to remember is that sea peoples is not a precise ethnic label. It's not one tribe, one nation, or one unified confederation in the modern sense. It is a retrospective category built from Egyptian sources that were themselves trying to make sense of complex movements in a time of crisis. So what, or who were they? Several overlapping possibilities are on the table. One view sees many of these groups as displaced populations from the wider eastern Mediterranean, people whose homelands in western Anatolia, the Aegean or coastal regions had been destabilized by earlier wars, famines, or political collapse. As states like the Hittite Empire and Mycenaean kingdoms fractured, warriors, farmers, and their families may have banded together in search of new lands, leveraging ships as both escape route and weapon. In this reading, those ox carts in Ramesses' reliefs matter. They suggest not just raiding parties, but migrating communities. Another angle emphasizes coalitions of opportunistic warbands, professional fighters, ex-soldiers from failed states, local chieftains and their followers, linking up temporarily to raid rich targets. From Egypt's perspective, such groups would look like a single wave, even if internally they were a patchwork of different origins. Piracy almost certainly plays a role too. As the old palatial authorities in Mycenae, Ugarit and Hattusa weakened, policing the sea lanes became harder. Merchant ships carrying copper, tin, grain and luxury goods were increasingly vulnerable. Some sea peoples may have started as pirates preying on trade routes, then scaled up into larger ventures as they found success and new allies. We also have hints that some of these groups were mercenaries before they became enemies. Earlier Egyptian records mention foreign warriors, like the Shurdan, serving in royal bodyguards or as elite troops. In a world of shifting loyalties and late payments, yesterday's hired swords could become tomorrow's raiders, especially if the states that once paid them could no longer guarantee steady income or land grants. And overlaying all of this is the possibility of refugees. If droughts, famine, and local conflicts were driving people off their land across the eastern Mediterranean, many would have been desperate enough to risk any passage that promised stability. Egypt, with its Nile floodplain, would have looked like a potential refuge, even as it struggled with its own problems. To officials at the Nile Delta, Large groups of hungry, armed migrants might not feel like refugees at all. They would feel like an invasion. The truth may be that all these categories displaced farmers, ambitious warbands, pirates, ex-mercenaries, and refugees bled into each other in practice. The Egyptian scribes, watching complex movements from their side of the frontier, collapsed that mess into a single phrase, peoples of the sea. Ramesses III's texts insist that Egypt triumphed. In a narrow military sense, that seems to be right. The Nile Valley was not overrun. Egyptian authority in the core regions survived. Unlike Hatti, there is no moment where the capital disappears under ash, no total administrative blackout. But survival came at a price. Fielding the armies that fought those battles and maintaining garrisons in the Levant as long as possible required immense resources. Shipbuilding, chariot forces, archers, fortifications along the eastern delta, all of this had to be funded, fed, and organized. Grain had to be collected, redistributed, and sometimes imported. The logistics were staggering. We see signs that, to pay for this, the state squeezed harder. Villages and estates along the Nile would have felt increased taxation in grain, labour, and service. Temples were granted large tracts of land and income in return for their support, but that also meant more wealth diverted into the priestly sphere and away from direct royal control. Work gangs were mobilized more frequently, rations stretched thinner when harvests were poor. Over time, this eroded the very base that made Egyptian power possible. By the later years of Ramesses III and his successors, we start to hear of strikes by tomb workers at Deir el-Medina, complaints of late payments, corruption, and mismanagement. These are not random anecdotes. They point to a system under financial and administrative strain, even as the official inscriptions still proclaim strength. Externally, Egypt's reach contracted. Its grip on Canaan loosened. Coastal cities that had once paid tribute shifted toward new powers or simply vanished. The proud network of garrisons and vassals in the Levant, maintained at such cost in the earlier New Kingdom, frayed and then largely fell away. Internally, power began to fragment. Priests of Amun at Thebes grew more independent. Regional commanders and high officials in the Delta amassed their own power bases. The grand facade of New Kingdom unity slowly cracked into a landscape of competing centres, still Egyptian, still looking back to the glory of earlier pharaohs, but less tightly controlled from a single point. So, when we say that Egypt survived the crisis that obliterated Hatti and the Mycenaean palaces, we have to hear the other half of that sentence. Egypt survived, but it was changed. It had weathered the waves of migrants and raiders that its inscriptions call sea peoples. It had fought off invasions by land and sea, but to do so it had taxed its people heavily, hollowed out parts of its bureaucracy, and ceded ground abroad. The empire of Thutmose III and Ramesses II, the Egypt that strode confidently into Syria and boasted of victories at Megiddo and Kadesh, was gone. In its place stood a more cautious kingdom, still monumental in stone, but increasingly compromised in practice. A state that had stayed afloat when others sank, but only by throwing overboard some of the cargo that had once made it so formidable. And just beyond Egypt's narrowed frontiers in the cities of the Levant, that had once been contested between Pharaoh and great king of Hatti, the storm was breaking in its own brutal way. North along that same Levantine coast, caught between Egyptian ambition and Hittite power, lay a smaller kingdom whose voice reaches us with startling intimacy, Ugarit. It was not a vast empire, not a superpower, like Egypt or Hatti. It was something else, a node, a medium-sized city with good harbours, fertile hinterlands, and excellent scribes, a place where ships from Cyprus, the Aegean, Egypt and Anatolia could all pull in, unload cargo, restock, and head out again. A city where merchants spoke multiple languages, where scribes could write in Akkadian, Hurrian, local Canaanite dialects, and even an alphabetic script scratched into clay. If the Late Bronze Age was a network, Ugarit was one of its key rotors. We know this because of what was left behind when the city burned. In palaces, temples, and private houses, archaeologists uncovered thousands of clay tablets, royal correspondence, legal contracts, shipping manifests, treaties, medical recipes, school exercises, even letters between merchants complaining about late payments. A whole paper trail of an interconnected world, except it's not on paper, it's baked into clay. And among these tablets are some of the last messages ever sent from that city. They don't read like calm administration, they read like panic. One letter, sent from Ugarit to the king of another city, complains of enemy ships already causing trouble along the coast. Another, perhaps the most famous, comes from the Ugaritic king Amurapi to the king of Alashiya, probably Cyprus. In it, Amurapi lays out his problem with a helpless clarity that is hard to forget. He explains that enemy vessels have appeared, that his own forces are scattered, that he has no way to defend both the land and the sea at once. He begs for help, for reinforcements, for any kind of assistance that might keep the city from falling. He mentions that other lands have already been devastated. The tone is not heroic, it is bureaucratic despair. Some letters from neighbouring powers echo that anxiety. One complains that a shipment of grain or goods from Ugarit has not arrived, and demands to know why. Another orders the king of Ugarit to send back conscripted troops and ships that had been dispatched to support the Hittite war effort somewhere else. Amurapi, obedient client king that he is, seems to have sent them, which means that when the crisis finally arrived at his own harbour wall, a chunk of his best-trained soldiers and ships were far away, fighting someone else's war. The tablets that preserve these complaints and pleas have a strange additional detail. In several cases, they were found unbaked. That matters. Clay tablets normally start as soft mud, then are dried, sometimes fired intentionally in kilns, sometimes just left to harden with time. When a building burns at high temperatures, unbaked tablets can be accidentally fired in the blaze and preserved almost indefinitely. That appears to be what happened at Ugarit. In storerooms and archive rooms, scribes had been actively at work. Letters were being written, sealed, filed. Some tablets were still in baskets waiting to be sorted. Then the city was attacked, buildings went up in flames, and the heat of the destruction horizon, archaeologists' term for that final layer of burning and collapse, baked the tablets hard. The moment of administrative crisis is frozen in place. We need to be careful about what that layer can and cannot tell us. The burn layer at Ugarit is thick and widespread. Many structures show signs of violent destruction: charred beams, collapsed walls, toppled statues. Objects lie where they fell. There is no clear evidence of later reoccupation on top of the ruins in Bronze Age style. When the fire went out, Ugarit as a late Bronze Age city-state was gone. This strongly suggests that the city did not fall gradually through slow decline or peaceful abandonment. Something abrupt happened, an attack, an internal uprising, a devastating fire, or some combination of these. But the archaeology cannot, on its own, tell us the identity of the attackers. Later scholars have been tempted to point straight to the Sea Peoples as described in Egyptian texts, to imagine the same fleets that hit Egypt also sweeping over Ugarit. That is possible. It may even be likely that maritime raiders were involved. Enemy ships do appear in the surviving letters. Yet we cannot carve it in stone. Those ships could have been any number of groups, displaced populations from the Aegean, Western Anatolian warbands, local coastal rivals taking advantage of Hittite weakness, even rebellious mercenaries or pirates once hired by Ugarit itself. The tablets do not come with a neat ethnic label. What we can see with unusual clarity is collapse being felt in real time. In the months or years leading up to the final destruction, the scribes of Ugarit were juggling bad news from multiple fronts. Grain shipments delayed, foreign orders for troops, complaints about bandits or pirates, warnings from inland allies that things were deteriorating, royal officials trying to decide which crisis to prioritize when there are too many to handle at once. For the king and his court, the fall of Ugarit was not an abstract geopolitical event. It was the terrifying realization that the safety net of the old order, Hittite protection, predictable trade, recognizable rules, had frayed beyond repair. And when Ugarit vanished, the shockwaves moved outward. Think about what it meant, in practical terms, to remove one major port from the eastern Mediterranean. Merchants sailing from Cyprus with cargoes of copper ingots suddenly lost a familiar destination, a place to anchor, trade and resupply before heading further south or east. Caravans from inland Syria that had once terminated at Ugarit's warehouses now had nowhere obvious to offload their goods onto ships. Royal envoys counting on Ugarit as a staging ground, sleeping in its guest quarters, storing their letters in its archives, found that link in the chain broken. Diplomatic messages that would once have passed through Ugaritic hands now had to find more dangerous, less reliable routes, if they moved at all. Even Egypt, which never ruled Ugarit directly, would have felt the ripple. Copper routes from Cyprus, timber flows from the Levant, luxury items moving between Anatolia and the Nile. All of these had relied on ports like Ugarit to keep the traffic smooth. Remove that nodal city, and the system does not instantly collapse everywhere. But it becomes less efficient, more fragile, more exposed to further shocks. In a world already dealing with drought signals, internal revolts, and shifting alliances, every lost port, every burned warehouse, every vanished archive made the entire network shakier. More merchants turned to short, safer routes. More local leaders hoarded resources. More states found themselves scrambling to replace missing links with ad hoc arrangements. Ugarit's last letters let us watch that process at the scale of individual decisions. A king delaying payment because he is short on grain. A governor asking for more troops because bandits are bolder than before. A scribe rushing to draft one more plea for aid as rumours of enemy ships grow louder. The tablets do not give us a grand theory of why the Bronze Age collapsed. They do something more intimate. They let us hear, almost directly, the voices of people whose world was coming apart, not in hindsight, but as it happened, one missed shipment, one unanswered letter, one burning building at a time. While coastal cities like Ugarit were going up in flames inland, along the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, the picture looked different. Not calm, not safe, just different. Mesopotamia, the old land between the rivers, had been a theatre of shifting power balances for centuries before the crisis hit. Kings in this region were used to turbulence. They almost specialized in it. At the southern end, in Babylonia, an ancient prestige clung to the land. This was the country of Hammurabi's memory, of towering ziggurats, of scribal schools that still copied epics and legal codes first written 1,000 years before. But in the late Bronze Age, Babylonia was no longer the unstoppable force of earlier eras. Kassite kings ruled from Babylon, a dynasty that had come in from elsewhere, absorbed the culture, and sat on the throne long enough for people to forget they had ever been outsiders. To the north, though, there was a newer power growing bolder with each generation, Assyria. Ashur, Nineveh, and other Assyrian cities lined the upper Tigris. From there, kings looked south to Babylon, west to Syria, north to Anatolia, and saw a world of opportunity. Their scribes wrote in the same Akkadian language as their Babylonian neighbours, but their ambitions were not the same. For much of the late Bronze Age, the political landscape here was not a simple map of fixed borders. It was more like a restless breathing, Assyria expanding, Babylonia pushing back, then both turning outward, forming alliances with Hatti, with Egypt, with Elam in the Iranian highlands. Letters flew back and forth on clay, marriage proposals, trade agreements, veiled threats. If the eastern Mediterranean coast was a web of harbours, Mesopotamia was a web of courts. And when the wider system started to shake, those courts felt it, just not always in the same way. Trade routes tied these river kingdoms to everything happening further west. Copper from Cyprus could move through Ugarit or other Levantine ports and then overland toward the Euphrates caravans. Tin, so crucial for making bronze, came from far to the east, but the finished metal, weapons and tools and luxury goods moved in every direction. Merchants in Babylonia and Assyria depended on foreign markets just as much as anyone in the Aegean. When coastal nodes like Ugarit failed, that flow did not stop overnight. It kinked. Ships started avoiding dangerous stretches. Overland routes were diverted. Goods that once passed smoothly from harbour to caravan to palace began to pile up in some places and vanish in others. A cargo delayed in a Levantine port might mean a temple workshop in Babylon waiting weeks longer for copper to arrive, or an Assyrian merchant defaulting on a promised delivery. Those weren't just inconveniences. In complex palace economies where food rations, land grants and temple endowments were tied to expected flows of goods, disruptions could ripple through the system. Add to this the people themselves. When cities on the coast or in Anatolia burned, not everyone died. Many fled, refugees, merchants, displaced soldiers, and whole communities on the move looked for safer ground. Some may have turned southeast, following the Euphrates downstream, seeking the deep-rooted cities whose names carried a sense of solidity. Mari's ruins, Babylon's temples, Nippur's sacred precincts. To the scribes and governors of Mesopotamia, such movements would have looked like opportunity and threat at once. Extra hands to work fields or serve in armies, but also extra mouths to feed in a world where harvests were increasingly uncertain. We don't have personal letters from Babylon as vivid as Amurapi's pleas from Ugarit, but we do see hints. Royal inscriptions that brag about putting down rebellions, expelling foreign troublemakers, reorganizing populations. Those are victory stories written to impress the gods and future generations, but behind them lurk real pressures. Inside the palaces, succession disputes added another layer of strain. Kassite Babylonia, already juggling its relationships with Assyria, Elam and distant allies, had to weather internal elite competition. Chronicles speak, sometimes briefly, sometimes with bitter detail, of kings overthrown, usurpers rising, rival claimants backed by foreign powers. A throne that changes hands in a coup does not necessarily bring everything to a halt. Scribes keep writing, temples keep sacrificing, farmers keep planting, but every disputed succession chips away at confidence. Officials hedge their bets. Provincial governors hold back taxes, waiting to see who wins. Neighbours watch closely, ready to assist their preferred candidate with troops. Assyria, meanwhile, rode a rising curve of aggression and instability of its own. Assyrian kings of the 13th and early 12th centuries pushed westward, taking cities in northern Syria, skirmishing on the very frontiers of Hittite control. They boasted of campaigns that reached the Mediterranean, of enemies crushed, of tribute flowing back to Ashur. These were years of expansion, but expansion is expensive. Armies need grain, weapons, pack animals. Roads have to be maintained. Garrisons have to be supported in far-flung territories that may or may not be loyal. When the larger late Bronze Age network began to wobble, when Hatti weakened under its own crises, when coastal cities burned, when caravans became less reliable, Assyria suddenly found itself in a landscape where the rules were changing mid-game. In such a world, any king's death could become a flashpoint. We hear of palaces intruded upon, rivals murdered, regicides justified in carefully written texts as purifications of the land. Each new ruler issued building inscriptions and victory records, trying to convince everyone that order had been restored, that the gods were again on his side. Yet despite the conflicts, the coups, the external wars, there is something striking about Mesopotamia in this period. It does not simply vanish, where the Mycenaean palaces burn and are not rebuilt in the same form, where Ugarit disappears from the historical stage. Babylon and Ashur keep reappearing in our sources. The Kassite dynasty eventually falls, but the city of Babylon remains a political and religious centre. Assyria suffers reverses, but later in the Iron Age it is back, stronger than ever, carving out one of the largest empires the Near East had yet seen. Why? Part of the answer lies in institutional depth. By the late second millennium, Babylonian and Assyrian societies had layers of organization that went beyond any single palace. Temples with their own landholdings and staff. City assemblies that could, in some periods, make collective decisions. Long-established legal traditions that scribes could copy and apply almost as a technical craft, regardless of which king happened to be in charge. The rivers themselves offered a kind of stability. Even when long-distance trade faltered, the Tigris and Euphrates could still move grain and goods between upstream and downstream communities. Canal systems, though vulnerable to neglect, could be repaired and reused. Local agriculture did not depend entirely on overseas shipments. It could be stretched, rearranged, taxed more harshly, but it existed as a relatively reliable base. This did not make Mesopotamia immune. It made its collapse uneven. Instead of a single spectacular breaking point, a layer of ashes over an entire land, we see a more complicated picture, dynasties ending, borders shifting, some cities shriveling while others slowly grow. Periods of contraction, followed by stuttering recoveries. Assyrian domination waxing and waning, Babylon falling under foreign influence, then reasserting itself. From a distance on a simplified map, it is tempting to use thick lines and sharp labels. Kassite Babylonia ends here, Assyria rises there. But on the ground, in fields and workshops and crowded neighbourhoods, the experience would have been less clean. A farmer along a canal might live through 3 different kings without ever leaving his village. A temple scribe could serve under a Kassite ruler, then under an Elamite-backed usurper, then under a new local dynasty, copying the same prayers and legal formulas all the while. For them, the late Bronze Age collapse was not a single night when everything burned. It was a long season of turbulence, foreign armies passing through, taxes going up, law codes being reissued with slightly different royal names, traders muttering that it's not as easy as it used to be to get tin from the west, grain from the north, cedar from the Levant. Mesopotamia's story in this era reminds us that collapse is not always a cliff. Sometimes it is a series of steps, a slow grinding down of complexity in some areas, even as others adapt and survive. And as we turn back toward the Levantine corridor, to Canaan and the small hill villages that start to appear as old cities burn, we'll see another version of that same process. A world not just destroyed but rearranged. From Mesopotamia's restless rivers, imagine walking west. The land tightens into a corridor between desert and sea. Hills rise, then fall toward a narrow coastal strip. To the south, Egypt. To the north, the ruined harbours of Ugarit and the fading reach of Hatti. This is Canaan, the Levant, a patchwork, not a single kingdom. In the late Bronze Age, this strip of land was a kind of contact zone, a middle ground threaded by roads, caravan tracks, and seasonal grazing routes. At its heart stood a constellation of small city-states. Hazor in the north, Megiddo guarding a key pass, Lachish and Gezer further south, Byblos and Tyre on the coast, and many others whose names flicker in Egyptian lists and Akkadian letters. Each city had its own king, its own walls, its own tiny orbit of villages and fields. None of them were superpowers. They survived by negotiating. To the west loomed Egypt, wealthiest state in the region, sometimes marching armies up into Canaan, sometimes ruling more softly through treaties and garrisons, but always watching. Egyptian pharaohs carved scenes of victory on temple walls, showing bound Canaanite chiefs, tribute parades, captured cities. In practice, though, they ruled less like direct administrators and more like senior partners. Local kings sent envoys and gifts south to the Nile, calling the pharaoh "my lord" while fighting petty wars with their neighbours. Egyptian commissioners set up in key strongholds, their scribes tracking deliveries of grain, timber, copper and soldiers. Garrison towns with Egyptian names and local populations dotted the map. It was a layered sovereignty above the golden aura of the pharaoh. Below, the gritty reality of city-state politics, raids, feuds and deals made at the city gate. Archaeology lets us trace what happened to this world when the wider system started to fracture. If you dig into many of these late Bronze Age cities, you eventually hit a line of charcoal and rubble, a destruction layer. Sometimes it is dramatic. Collapsed walls, arrowheads caught in fallen masonry, thick ash. Hazer's upper city, for instance, ends in a fierce burn. Parts of Lachish show signs of violent destruction. Other sites show quieter endings, sections abandoned, neighbourhoods left empty, fortifications never fully repaired. The timing is clustered, late 13th to early 12th century BC. The same broad window as the fall of Ugarit, the troubles in Hatti, the upheavals shaking Mycenaean Greece. Yet, above those ash lines, something unexpected appears. Not just ruins and emptiness, but new kinds of settlements. Smaller, humbler, scattered in places that had not been heavily occupied before, especially in the hill country inland from the main trade routes. Where there had been a few fortified centres and large estates, now there are hundreds of modest villages. Simple four-room houses, few luxury imports, lots of storage jars, silos, terraces for agriculture, fields hacked into hillsides, cisterns cut into rock. In the lowlands and along the coast, some cities are rebuilt, often on a reduced scale, sometimes with new populations. Others shrink to small towns perched among their own ruins. But in the hills there is a demographic bloom. It is as if the social map has inverted. The bright nodes of the old palace network dim, while the faint background of rural life suddenly flares into focus. Material culture shifts too. Late Bronze Age Canaanite cities were plugged into the international style of the day. Their elites drank from imported Cypriot bowls, stored oil and wine in jars stamped with foreign marks, wrote in Aegean on clay tablets, and used Egyptian names in diplomatic letters. After the destructions, those markers thin out. Imported luxury goods become scarcer. Local pottery dominates. Simpler forms, mass-produced in nearby kilns. Weapons change, tools change. In some regions, new ceramic styles appear that look different enough from earlier Canaanite wares that archaeologists can track them almost like a signature. On the southern coastal plain, at places like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, we see one of these new signatures clearly, a pottery style with roots in the Aegean world evolving over time into a local hybrid. Alongside it appear new foods, new architectural habits, and eventually new names in the written record, the Philistines. Further inland, especially in the central highlands, the pottery looks different again. Mostly coarse everyday wares, a conspicuous shortage of pig bones in the animal remains at many sites. Simple houses clustering around small courtyards. Over the next couple of centuries, later texts will start to associate that hill country with a different label, Israel. And under all of this, older Canaanite traditions persist. Local deities whose names never quite vanish, place names that survive king after king, practices that carry through the break. Who were these people then? Were the new hill villagers Israelites arriving from somewhere else? Were the coastal newcomers sea peoples from the Aegean, carving out their own patch of land? Were the remaining city folk still Canaanites, clinging to a fading order? The evidence is messy, and scholars argue. Some see large-scale migrations. Groups from the collapsing Mycenaean world, from western Anatolia or the central Mediterranean, arriving by sea, settling on the southern coast, bringing their pottery traditions and some of their gods with them. These would become the Philistine Pentapolis, a network of 5 cities that later Hebrew texts remember as powerful rivals. Others emphasize internal dynamics. They argue that many of the new hill villages look like local Canaanites moving upslope, away from contested lowlands and vulnerable coastal plains, reorganizing themselves as small-scale farmers and herders. On this view, Israel begins not as an invading horde, but as a new identity forming among people already in the land, adapting to a changed world. Most likely both processes are at work. Some groups almost certainly came from overseas. Others shifted location within the region. Still others stayed put in older towns, surviving, intermarrying, gradually absorbing newcomers. Mixed communities form where Aegean-style pots sit on tables built by Canaanite masons, where Egyptian scarabs are heirlooms in houses that now eat like inland farmers. Identity in this period is not a set of clean boxes. It is a spectrum of overlapping customs, languages, and loyalties. What we can say with more confidence is that the breakdown of the Late Bronze Age trade network changed incentives. When long-distance trade is reliable, it rewards centralization. Palace economies flourish by controlling bottlenecks, ports, passes, redistribution centers. Local elites build big storage facilities so they can stockpile grain, wine, and imported goods, then dispense them to dependents and allies. Ordinary farmers may be tied into these systems, paying taxes, serving in corvée labor, but also benefiting from the security and occasional surplus. When that network frays, the advantages shift. For a peasant watching caravans go from frequent to occasional, for a town watching Egyptian garrisons withdraw, for local leaders seeing tribute demands rise while protection falls, the calculus changes. The palaces no longer guarantee stability. Imported luxuries become unreliable. Foreign soldiers are as likely to be raiders as protectors. One rational response is to scale down, move to a spot that is less visible from major roads. Invest more in terraces and cisterns than in city walls. Diversify crops. Keep herds that can be moved if danger comes. Build houses around shared courtyards where extended families can pool resources. Depend less on imported bronze and more on whatever metal or stone you can get locally. In short, lean into subsistence, into local resilience. That is what the explosion of hill villages looks like. People reorganizing life around smaller, tighter communities that can ride out uncertain times without relying too heavily on distant kings. But this is not a story of simple replacement where Canaanites vanish and Philistines and Israelites appear from nowhere. We still see continuity. Many cities are never completely abandoned. Megiddo, for example, contracts and changes but remains occupied. Hazor has later phases built atop its ruins. Coastal towns like Tyre and Sidon survive the crisis and go on to thrive in the Iron Age as Phoenician ports, trading far beyond the Mediterranean. Cult sites persist, though their architecture and rituals evolve. The languages of the region shift slowly, not overnight. Older Canaanite dialects shade into early Hebrew and Phoenician over generations. Even the newcomers blend in. Philistine pottery starts out looking very Aegean, but over a century or two adopts local shapes and techniques. Diet patterns converge with those of their neighbours. Deities merge or sit side by side. The sharp edges of migration soften into a hybrid culture. Under the smoke of burning palaces and the silence of abandoned halls, life is not stopping. It is rethreading itself along different lines. From the highlands down to the coastal plain, across the old Canaanite heartland, the late Bronze Age collapse is less a clean break than a reconfiguration. Power decentralized, trade routes rerouted, identities renegotiated. The great kings of Egypt might have still carved scenes of victory, but in the hills above their old garrisons, families were planting vines, building stone terraces, giving children names that would one day fill new stories, stories told not about pharaohs or Hittite lords, but about shepherds, judges, and small communities trying to make a life in the long shadow of a fallen world. And as the Levant reorganized itself from the ground up, one island out in the eastern Mediterranean still held a key resource every power needed. The collapse of the old order would twist that island's fate too, and with it, the supply of the metal that had defined an age. Out in the eastern Mediterranean between Anatolia and the Levant lies an island that seems almost peripheral on a modern map. In the late Bronze Age it was anything but. Cyprus was a fulcrum. Not because of wheat fields or great armies, not because of a sprawling empire, but because of one thing pulled from its mountains and smelted in its workshops: copper. The very name Cyprus may be tied to the word for copper in ancient languages. This wasn't a coincidence. The island's geology made it rich in copper ores, and in an age when bronze was the metal of choice for weapons, tools, chariots, and prestige items, that put Cyprus in a position of quiet leverage over almost everyone. Bronze is an alloy. You take copper, mix in a smaller amount of tin, and you get a metal that is harder, more durable, and better suited for blades and armour than pure copper alone. Tin was relatively rare and came from scattered sources, some quite distant. But copper, in industrial quantities, poured out of Cyprus. From at least the 15th century BC onward, Cypriot copper moved in bulk across the eastern Mediterranean. We have shipwrecks like Uluburun off the coast of modern Turkey, carrying dozens of copper ingots shaped like oxides, standardized slabs stamped and branded, many almost certainly from Cypriot mines. We have texts from Egypt, from Ugarit, from Hittite archives, mentioning copper shipments, copper requests, copper tributes. When a palace wanted to arm its soldiers, to outfit its chariot corps, to send a gleaming gift to a rival king, it needed bronze. And to get bronze, it needed copper, which in practice meant it needed Cyprus. This gave the island a peculiar status. Cyprus was not a single united kingdom in this period. It was a patchwork of city centres, Enkami, Kitchen, Hala Sultan Teke, and others, each controlling hinterlands, harbours, and crucially access to mines in the interior. They linked outward through trade to Egypt, to the Levantine ports, to Hatti in the north, to the Aegean world further west. On the ground, the island looked like a dense node in the late Bronze Age network. Warehouses stacked with oxhide ingots, potters copying foreign styles to cater to export markets, scribes writing in a local script we still can't fully read, dockworkers hauling cargo that would end up as blades in a Hittite soldier's hand or fittings on an Egyptian ship. As the wider system shook, Cyprus was caught in the turbulence. Archaeology shows that the island did not simply sail through the 12th century untouched. At several major sites, we see signs of upheaval. Enkami on the east coast flourished during the height of the Bronze Age. Streets, workshops, storerooms full of copper ingots. Then, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries, it experienced violent destructions more than once. Layers of burning, collapsed buildings, and hurried rebuilding suggest cycles of attack and recovery, not a single clean end. Kitchen, further south, shows its own pattern of change. Old quarters fall into ruin. New temples and industrial areas rise, sometimes with signs of new cultural influences, possibly groups with closer ties to the Levant or Aegean. Other coastal centres shift location slightly, as if populations are regrouping along different stretches of shore. We find defensive works strengthened, fortifications heightened or repaired. Some inland sites, closer to the copper sources, gain in importance relative to older coastal hubs, hinting at a reorientation of priorities. Protect the mines, protect the metal. The causes are murky, Were these destructions the work of seaborne raiders, the same kinds of groups that appear in Egyptian inscriptions under the label Sea Peoples? Were they the result of internal conflict between rival Cypriot cities vying for control of a strategic resource in a time of scarcity? Or were they symptoms of economic strain, as the old export markets faltered and cities built on trade struggled to adapt? The evidence allows different readings, and scholars disagree. Some patterns suggest external attacks, burn layers coinciding with similar dates at Levantine and Anatolian sites. Imported pottery styles that look, at least initially, like they come with new people, forts oriented toward the sea. Other clues point inward, gradual shifts in settlement, not just one-off destructions, changes in how copper is processed and stored, signs that some industries are scaling down, others retooling, as if local elites are trying to restructure an economy whose external outlets are shrinking. What is clearer is the effect. The smooth flow of copper from Cyprus into the wider network became less reliable. If ships are being lost, if harbours are unsafe, if local wars threaten mines or transport routes, then the regular caravans of ingots to Ugarit, to Hittite ports, to Egyptian outposts begin to thin. Palaces expecting steady deliveries may suddenly face delays, shortfalls or price spikes. For a while, storerooms and old stockpiles can cover the gap. Bronze can be recycled, old statues can be melted down. Broken tools can be reforged, but recycling is a short-term buffer, not a permanent solution. As the 12th century opens, we start to see more weapons and tools made of iron in some regions. At first, iron is rare and often treated as a prestige material. But over time, as bronze supplies wobble and ironworking techniques improve, the balance begins to shift. This transition is not instantaneous, nor is it solely due to Cyprus. Tin routes matter too. Local policies matter, but copper disruption is part of the story. Think about what that means for military capacity. A late Bronze Age palace state measures its strength partly in chariots, in well-equipped infantry, in metal-tipped spears and arrows. If armour is harder to replace, if spearheads must be reused, if new bronze can't be produced at the same scale, then training an army and keeping it battle-ready becomes more expensive and fragile. Small losses that might once have been absorbed, some ships captured, a storehouse looted, start to bite deeper when there is less metal coming in behind them. Commanders might hesitate to risk elite troops if their gear can't be easily replaced. Local chiefs, cut off from central supplies, might struggle to arm retainers at all. Meanwhile, in the countryside, people adapt. Tools become simpler, often made from whatever is at hand. Ploughs and sickles may use more wood and stone, less metal. Weapons shift form. The gleaming bronzes that symbolized royal power become rarer outside a few surviving centres. Cyprus lives this from both sides. Its cities depend on external demand for copper, on stable routes to send out ingots and bring back grain, oil, luxury goods, and political favour. When Ugarit burns, when Hittite authority cracks, when Egyptian garrisons pull back, Cyprus loses key customers and partners. Ships that once left its harbours bound for reliable markets now sail into uncertainty. If the mines are still producing but the buyers are collapsing, copper that once powered palaces can pile up uselessly in warehouses. Workers go unpaid. Local rulers lose the rents and tributes that finance their courts. Internal tensions rise. On the other hand, if raiders and rival powers fight over the island precisely because of its copper, mining and smelting can be disrupted at the source. Facilities burned, labour forces scattered. In that case, the bottleneck tightens from the supply side instead. Either way, the logic is the same. When a complex system depends heavily on a few key inputs that flow through narrow channels, those channels become points of vulnerability. A drought can shrink harvests across a region, but a disruption at a single strategic island can ripple outward along every trade route that relied on it. Cyprus in the late Bronze Age shows us how this works, not as a dramatic central actor like Egypt's pharaohs or Hatti's great kings, but as a crucial hinge in the machinery behind them. When that hinge starts to grind or crack, the doors of empire don't slam shut right away, but they stop swinging smoothly. Every other problem, famine, war, rebellion, hits harder in a world where the copper lifeline is fraying. And as that lifeline faltered, the whole interconnected web began to feel the strain. Ships sailed less often, caravans left with smaller loads. Letters begging for metal went unanswered. The old assurance that somewhere on some coast a warehouse on Cyprus was already stacking ingots for you no longer held. When that kind of confidence evaporates, trade doesn't just slow. It starts to unravel, and in a world built on bronze, losing faith in copper was one more step toward losing faith in the entire system. So what does it actually mean for trade to collapse? Not in the abstract, not as a vague phrase in a history book, but on the ground, in the daily rhythms of the late Bronze Age world. It starts with things you can touch, with ships. For generations, the eastern Mediterranean had been stitched together by hulls of wood and ropes of fibre, by sailors who knew the winds and the currents, by captains who could navigate from Cyprus to Ugarit, from Ugarit to Byblos, from Byblos to the Nile Delta, almost on instinct. These ships carried copper and tin, of course, but also grain, oil, wine, textiles, timber, glass, luxury goods, diplomatic gifts, news and people. They were the moving arteries of a shared world. When trade begins to falter, the first sign is often that fewer ships leave harbour. Storms that once would have been shrugged off become reasons to delay. Pirate activity or raiders on the coast make certain routes feel too risky. A port that used to welcome foreign merchants suddenly imposes extra dues, detains cargo, or simply fails to pay what it owes. And beneath the ships, invisible but just as real, lies something even more fragile: credit and trust. Late Bronze Age palaces did not move goods purely on the basis of coin in hand. Much of this economy ran on promises, clay tablets recording obligations. I will send you 50 talents of copper next season. You will deliver grain to my garrison, and I will repay you in oil and textiles. Merchants advanced goods on the expectation that royal scribes would later tally the accounts correctly. Middlemen took risks, because they believed that if a cargo was lost, someone higher up might help absorb the damage. Trade collapse is what happens when those promises stop being believable. A palace fails to pay on time, a warehouse burns, and no compensation comes. A partner city is suddenly sacked, its scribes killed, its archives turned to ash. Debts recorded on fragile tablets become meaningless when the issuing authority vanishes overnight. Word spreads quickly, carried by the same ships that still manage to sail. Don't extend credit to that port. They're in trouble. That king is not honouring his treaties. That city doesn't answer anymore. Once that kind of talk circulates, merchants pull back. They demand payment up front. They avoid certain harbours. They hoard rather than move what wealth they have left. Storage changes too. In stable times, palaces and major households keep large storehouses filled with grain, oil and metal. Not all of it is for immediate use. Much of it is a buffer, a way of smoothing out bad harvests or delays at sea. It is also working capital. A ruler can release grain to feed workers, then recoup value later in kind. But if trade slows, stockpiles become ambiguous. Store too little, and a single bad year can starve you. Store too much, and your wealth sits idle, unable to be exchanged for the foreign goods and allies you once relied on. If you fear raids or internal unrest, those very storerooms turn into tempting targets. Now layer this onto the structure of palace economies. These were not free market systems with countless small producers and buyers. They were heavily centralized. The palace in Mycenae or Hattusa or Ugarit did not just collect taxes, it orchestrated production. Scribes tracked hundreds of workers, weavers, metal smiths, chariot makers, carpenters, perfumers, assigning rations, recording outputs, reallocating labour from one project to another. Specialists depended on regular inflows of raw materials: wool, flax, hides, copper, tin, imported woods, aromatic resins. The palace model works beautifully when inputs are predictable. Caravans arrive when expected. Ships dock in the right season. Tin from far-off mountains combines with Cypriot copper to feed the bronze workshops. Wool from dependent communities keeps the looms busy. In that situation, central planning can be remarkably efficient. The palace can produce armies, fleets, luxury goods, and monumental buildings on a scale no private household could dream of. But when you pull on one thread of that web, the whole pattern tightens and twists. Think of the tin. Tin sources were scattered and distant, possibly in Anatolia, the eastern Taurus, maybe even as far as Central Asia or beyond. We don't fully know all the routes, but we do know that tin travelled through multiple hands and over great distances before landing in coastal ports and palace storerooms. Lose even part of that chain and bronze production chokes. Without tin, copper is still valuable, but it cannot make the same strong blades, gleaming helmets, and durable tools. You can recycle old bronze, breaking up redundant statues, melting down damaged weapons. That buys time. It does not solve the underlying problem. Armies are particularly vulnerable. A chariot core is not just horses and wheels. It is a bundle of metal, fittings, axle parts, spearheads, arrowheads, armour. Bronze makes it work. If you cannot replace broken pieces easily, every skirmish carries a new cost. Every lost chariot is not just a dead warrior, it is a smaller inventory of reusable metal. Even humble tools matter. Sickles, axes, chisels, fishing hooks. If bronze is scarce, agriculture and construction slow down. Fields are harder to work, boats are harder to repair. The palace's ability to command labour becomes less potent when it cannot supply the tools that make that labour productive. Yet trade is not only the palace and the raw materials. It is also people whose full-time job is to keep connections alive. Merchants, ship captains, caravan leaders, interpreters, scribes used to dealing with foreign scripts and languages. Port officials who know which family and which inland village can supply 100 pack animals at short notice. Dock workers who have unloaded this type of cargo 100 times and can stack it so that it does not spoil on the journey inland. These are the human buffers in the system. When things go wrong, when a ship is delayed, when a tax demand is unexpectedly high, when a storm scatters a convoy, these are the people who improvise solutions. They call in favours. They reroute shipments. They work around temporary obstacles. Port infrastructure is a buffer too. Breakwaters, warehouses, quays, beacon towers, repair yards. When kept in good order, they allow a damaged ship to be refitted, a large surplus to be stored, an emergency grain shipment to be unloaded quickly and distributed inland before it rots. But what happens when war touches the ports? A single raid can burn warehouses, destroy cranes and storage jars, and scatter the specialized workers who knew how to use them. If a city like Ugarit loses its harbour installations, even if the political authority survives on paper for a while, its function as a trade hub is crippled. Merchants go somewhere else, or nowhere at all. Without active merchants and working ports, every shock lands harder. There is no one who remembers how to patch the network. This is where systems thinking helps make sense of the collapse. Imagine the late Bronze Age not as a set of independent kingdoms, but as a tightly coupled system with flows of goods, information, and people constantly moving along its links. In such a system, Failures are rarely isolated. A drought in one region reduces grain surplus. That region imports more food from its neighbours, paying in copper or textiles. The exporting region, now drawing down its own reserves, has less buffer if its harvest next year is poor. If, at the same time, tin shipments falter, palaces must choose, use bronze reserves for weapons, or retool tools for agriculture. Every choice creates feedback. If they prioritise the army, fields might be under-equipped, leading to worse harvests and more dependence on imports. If they prioritise tools, military power declines, making them more vulnerable to attack or revolt. Either way, the risk profile of the entire system shifts. Now add trade distrust. Merchants, sensing danger, demand better terms or stay home. Palaces, angry at shrinking supplies, impose controls or seize goods, further undermining trust. A king fails to pay his debts, so foreign traders avoid his ports. His revenues drop, making it harder to pay the next set of obligations. That is a feedback loop too, economic and political. Cascading failures arise when these loops intersect. A burned port means fewer ships, which means less tin, which means weaker armies, which means more successful raids, which burn more ports, which further reduce trade. A failed harvest means greater reliance on imported food. Just as merchants are becoming more cautious, so prices rise, so ordinary farmers suffer, so unrest grows, so elites crack down, scaring away what merchants remain. No single event causes the collapse in this view. Instead, each shock storm, raid, bad harvest, dynastic crisis hits a system whose margins are already thinner because previous shocks have eroded its buffers. The networks that once let cities and kingdoms help each other now transmit stress as easily as they once transmitted wealth. Trade collapse is both symptom and amplifier. It reflects underlying strain, political, environmental, military, and then in turn magnifies that strain by removing the very connections that used to provide resilience. By the time letters from places like Ugarit start to sound desperate, by the time kings beg for grain, for metal, for ships that never come, the dominoes have already been falling in slow motion for years. And behind those clay tablets and silent harbours lies a deeper story, one of climate and harvests, of rivers and rains, nudging the system toward its breaking point. When historians talk about climate in the Late Bronze Age, they are not secretly time-travelling with thermometers and rain gauges. They are reading traces, pollen grains buried in lake mud, each one a microscopic record of what plants were growing nearby in a given century, shrinking and expanding shorelines of ancient lakes, marked in layered sediments and abandoned harbours, stalactites and stalagmites in caves, speleothems, whose thin bands of calcite grow faster or slower, depending on how much water drips through the rock above. The ratios of oxygen and carbon isotopes trapped in those bands, or in shells, or in old groundwater, whispering clues about temperature, rainfall, and evaporation. Put together, these are the proxies, the indirect witnesses. In cores from lakes in Anatolia and the Levant, pollen from moisture-loving plants declines around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, while hardy, drought-tolerant species become more common. Some lakes show lower stands, more exposed shorelines, higher salinity. Caves in Israel, Cyprus, and nearby regions preserve speleothem layers whose isotopic signatures shift in ways that are consistent with all the usual caveats with drier conditions. But consistent with is as far as we can honestly go. Each proxy record has its own quirks, its own clock. Radiocarbon dates come with error bars. Layers get disturbed by burrowing animals, earthquakes, or later human activity. Speleothems can stop growing for a while and then start again. A lake's level might respond not only to rainfall, but to how much water people upstream are diverting for irrigation. So when researchers line up these different records, they do not get a crisp, single line saying, Drought begins in 1207 BC and ends in 1174 BC. They get overlapping bands of probability. A dry spell that might have started as early as the mid-1200s or as late as the 1190s. Intensifications that may not be synchronous everywhere. In some areas, more of a series of bad years with occasional relief. In others, a longer, grinding decline. Still, patterns emerge. Across much of the eastern Mediterranean, there are signals that the climate became more variable and on average drier around the time the palace systems were faltering. Not a sudden switch from green to desert, but a shift that meant less reliable harvests, lower margins, more risk. Imagine what that does to a world already running on tight central planning and long-distance trade. A palace that has counted on 3 good harvests out of 4 might suddenly find that only 1 in 3 is truly abundant. The difference between average and slightly below average rainfall becomes the difference between full granaries and anxious rationing. Bad harvests translate directly into numbers on clay tablets. Grain deliveries fall short, ration lists shrink. Workers who once received full measures of barley now get partials. Scribes note famine year or record that fields have failed. In Egyptian texts, we start to see references to food shortages, to hungry people from Canaan crossing the border seeking grain. Hittite documents from slightly earlier periods already hint at recurring famine crises and emergency imports from Egypt. In markets, grain prices spike. We see this clearly a few centuries later in other Near Eastern documents. But the logic is the same. When local harvests fail, the price of staple food jumps relative to everything else. A sheep, a piece of land, a fine cloak, all buy less grain than they used to. For ordinary families, that means selling more of what they have just to eat. For the palace, it means that attempts to buy grain from elsewhere become painfully expensive, especially when trade networks are already fraying. Hungry people move. A farmer who has lost 2 harvests in a row might abandon marginal land and head toward a city in hope of rations or work. A group of tribes on the edge of the system might press further into settled lands, following rumours of better conditions or simply moving away from parched pasture. The inscriptions that mention sea peoples also mention those who are on the water, those who are on the road, groups that sound as much like displaced populations as organised invading armies. This is one way drought turns into migration pressure. Not necessarily in one giant wave, but as repeated pushes and pulls. Pastoralists whose flocks cannot find enough grazing might raid a neighbouring region, or offer themselves as mercenaries or beg for asylum. Every option adds strain to someone else's system. And famine is not just a physical crisis, it is political. A king of the late Bronze Age was not only a warrior and a judge. He was a provider. Many royal titles emphasize the ruler as shepherd of the people, the one who ensures order, abundance, the proper flow of offerings to the gods. When the fields fail and distributions shrink, that image cracks. If the king cannot keep the granaries full, perhaps the gods are angry. Perhaps the king has sinned or is simply weak. In such moments, legitimacy becomes fragile. Elites may hoard what grain there is, deepening resentment. Local strongmen might step into the gap, promising food in exchange for loyalty. Vassal states might question whether their overlord can still protect them, or whether it is time to switch allegiance or rebel outright. Here is where climate stress does its most devastating work, not as an alternative to war, invasion, or trade collapse, but as their accomplice. A dry sequence of years makes harvests unreliable. That makes cities more dependent on imported grain, just as we saw trade networks fraying. Merchants, already nervous about piracy or unpaid debts, now confront desperate buyers. Prices rise, accusations of profiteering spread, riots become more likely. Armies that once could be fed from royal storehouses must forage more aggressively, or live off the land in enemy territory, making every campaign an act of pillage. Raiders find that a hungry countryside is easier to terrorize and less able to defend itself. Civil conflicts grow harsher when there is not enough food to cushion defeat. Meanwhile, in the palaces, scribes and rulers might still think of the problem as solvable, just one more bad run to be endured, one more shipment to be begged from an ally, one more group of migrants to be resettled. From our distance, looking at pollen diagrams and speleothem curves, it is tempting to draw a neat arrow: drought, famine, collapse. But the real picture is more entangled. Some regions with clear drought signals limp on. Some cities burn in places where the climate data look relatively stable. The same dry years that ruin one kingdom might merely strain another that has better reserves or a more flexible social structure. The climate proxies tell us that the late Bronze Age world was under environmental stress. They do not tell us, on their own, which walls would fall, which palaces would burn, which communities would adapt. For that, we have to look at the other forces already in motion: earthquakes, wars, rebellions, institutional rigidity. All of them interacting with a sky that grew just a little more unreliable, and fields that could no longer be counted on to bear the same old weight. If the sky was becoming unreliable, the ground was not much more trustworthy. Along the eastern Mediterranean, from Greece through Anatolia, down into the Levant, the earth sits on a web of active fault lines. It always has. Ancient people knew in the most direct way possible that the ground could heave, walls could fall, and the sea could suddenly run away and then come roaring back. In the 20th and 21st centuries, some archaeologists and geophysicists began to wonder whether this geological restlessness played a starring role in the late Bronze Age collapse. They proposed what has come to be called an earthquake storm, not a single apocalyptic quake that shatters every city in one night, but a cluster of powerful earthquakes rippling along connected faults over decades. One segment of a major fault slips, transferring stress down the line. Years later, another section ruptures, then another. Each event is local, but over a human lifetime, it can feel like the whole world is taking turns shaking itself apart. The appeal of this idea is obvious. Many of the regions hardest hit by the collapse, Mycenaean Greece, western Anatolia, the Levant, lie right along major fault systems. Excavations at places like Mycenae, Tiryns, Miletus, Ugarit and other sites have uncovered toppled walls, crushed skeletons, and what some researchers interpret as patterns of damage consistent with seismic shaking rather than enemy siege. In some layers you get a very particular kind of destruction: walls thrown in alternating directions, columns snapped at their bases, floors warped, doorways twisted, fallen stones lying in jumbled heaps with no obvious burn layer on top. At a few sites you find statues or cult images toppled forward, as if shoved from behind by an invisible hand. All of that makes the earthquake storm hypothesis tempting. It offers a physical mechanism that could, in theory, affect dozens of cities spaced along a broad arc, without requiring that a single invading army march from one end to the other. Faults do not respect political borders. A kingdom might think of itself as secure behind walls and chariots, but none of that matters if the palace itself is suddenly a pile of rubble. Yet the earth does not keep historical time for us. Linking a particular destruction layer to a specific earthquake, let alone stringing together a whole series into a coherent storm, is notoriously difficult. This is where the archaeology gets messy. Fire is easier to see than shaking. A burned city leaves a black, ashy scar in the ground. Charred beams, collapsed roofs that fell inward while burning, rooms sealed beneath melted pottery and baked mud brick. Radiocarbon dates from those charred remains can be reasonably precise. Earthquakes, by contrast, are shy in the archaeological record. They do not always leave a clean signature. Buildings can collapse in very similar ways, whether they are shattered by tremors, undermined by fire, or deliberately demolished by attackers. Stones topple, roofs fall in, skeletons are buried in the rubble in every scenario. Later rebuilding can chew up the evidence, reusing blocks, smoothing over tilted floors, cutting new foundations through old debris. Even where damage looks seismic, we have to ask hard questions. Was the wall already weakened by age or poor construction? Did an enemy set fires after the shaking, leaving a mixed layer that looks like both? How accurate are our dates? Are we looking at a single catastrophe or 2 or 3 separate events compressed by erosion and later building into what seems like one? So while some sites do appear to show compelling evidence of earthquake damage around the time of the collapse, others do not. And the timings we can assign often come with error ranges of decades, sometimes more. An earthquake storm, if it happened, would have unfolded within those same decades. That means we are always working inside a blur, a burned palace here, a tilted wall there, written records mostly silent about quakes, unless they were truly extraordinary. Hittite and Egyptian texts mention disasters occasionally, but they are just as likely to attribute them to angry gods as to unstable faults. Still, we do not need to imagine a perfectly synchronized ring of fire to see how seismic unrest could matter. Think about what even a single major earthquake does to a complex state. Walls crack, temples and palaces collapse, storage jars shatter, spilling grain, oil and wine that took years to accumulate. Administrative archives burn or are buried, wiping out records of who owes what, which vassal promised, which shipment, which merchants are waiting for payment. All of that has to be repaired. Stone has to be quarried, timber cut, labourers fed while they rebuild instead of farming. Skilled craftsmen who might have been making chariot parts or fine textiles are diverted to replastering walls and casting new door hinges. The palace sends out urgent demands for materials, for draft animals, for specialists. Every unexpected rebuilding project is a withdrawal from the kingdom's savings account. In good times, with full storehouses and healthy trade routes, that might be survivable. The palace spends a few years tightening belts, postponing some luxuries, raising special levies, and eventually the city stands proud again. In the late Bronze Age, though, many of those safety nets were already fraying. Drought was nibbling at harvests. Trade was becoming less reliable. Military campaigns cost more and brought in less. Vassals were wavering. When an earthquake hit a system like that, it was landing on a body already bruised. One quake might force a king to raid his own temples for precious metals, melting votive offerings into emergency bullion. A second, a few decades later, might damage the same city again before it had fully recovered. Another kingdom along the same fault line suffers similar blows, just as it is sending food or bronze to its allies. Treasuries drain, not because they were mismanaged in some obvious way, but because bad luck keeps arriving faster than reserves can be rebuilt. Meanwhile, defences weaken. Crumbling fortifications are patched cheaply, not properly rebuilt. Garrison troops are diverted to labour service. Local magnates grumble about new taxes and forced work details. Refugees from ruined villages crowd into the city, needing food and shelter. From the outside this looks like opportunity. A rival ruler, a band of raiders, a restless subject people, any of these might decide that a half-repaired city, its army exhausted by rebuilding and famine relief, is the perfect target. Earthquakes do not need to level every wall. They just need to create an opening at the wrong moment. So, where do earthquakes and sudden disasters sit in the story of 1177 BC? Probably not as the single villain that strode across the stage and pushed every palace down with one shove. More likely as one of several trigger mechanisms in a system whose margins had grown thin. A bad year of rain in ordinary times is a problem. The same bad year, coming right after an earthquake has wrecked your granaries, and before your latest shipment of grain arrives, or fails to arrive, can be a catastrophe. A fire that might have been contained when the city watch was well fed and well-equipped spirals out of control when half the wells are choked with rubble and the watch has been reduced to cut costs. A plague that might once have been localized spreads faster through a population already crammed into makeshift housing after a quake. Disasters are not just about the magnitude of the event. They are about the thickness of the buffers. In the late Bronze Age, those buffers, surplus grain, fiscal reserves, loyal vassals, redundant trade routes, robust defences were being eroded from multiple directions. In that context, an earthquake, a fire, a tsunami, or an epidemic were not isolated misfortunes. They were catalysts. They turned strain into crisis, and crisis into something that looked, from the ground, like the end of the world. When buffers thin out, somebody has to pay the difference. In a late Bronze Age palace economy, that somebody is almost never the king or the highest elites. It is the farmers on the valley floors, the herders on the hillsides, the craftsmen in the back rooms of the workshops, and the young men who suddenly find themselves wearing armour instead of ploughing fields. The palaces had tools to extract what they needed: taxes, labour dues, and conscription. In good years, this might feel like the price of order. The palace takes its share of grain, wool, and metal, but in return it keeps the roads safe, the temples stocked, and the enemy at bay. The king calls up a levy for a limited campaign season, then releases the men back home. In bad years the balance shifts. When drought cuts the harvest and earthquakes wreck the granaries and trade stutters, the palace cannot simply accept less. It has fixed costs, chariots to maintain, scribes to pay, gods to appease with offerings, foreign kings to impress with gifts. So it leans harder on the people who can least afford it. Tax demands go up, not down. Where a farmer once surrendered a portion of his barley and olives, now he is required to deliver more to make up the shortfall from elsewhere. Where a shepherd once owed a few animals each year, now the quotas quietly rise. And if he cannot pay, he does not simply get a pass. He goes into debt. Bronze Age debt was not an abstract entry on a spreadsheet. It was a relationship. A man who could not meet his obligations might have to pledge part of his land, or the labour of his household, to an official or a local magnate. Over time, those local power brokers accumulate more and more control over the countryside, while the smallholders become increasingly desperate. Now insert conscription into that picture. At the same time that taxes are climbing, the palace is also demanding service. More garrisons on the frontiers, more men to escort caravans along suddenly dangerous roads, more troops for campaigns against rebellious vassals or raiders. Every young man taken into the army is one less set of hands to plant and harvest. If he returns, he brings with him scars, grievances, and perhaps a new sense of his own power. If he does not return, his family may slip entirely into dependency, becoming tenants on what used to be their own fields. Multiply this process across decades of stress, and you begin to see how revolt stops being an abstract possibility and starts to feel like the next logical step. We do not have manifestos from Bronze Age peasants spelling this out. What we do see in text and archaeology are hints of the pressure building. Letters from palaces complain about villages failing to meet their quotas. Edicts threaten harsh punishments for those who withhold taxes or flee their obligations. Some texts from Mesopotamia and the Levant hint at bands or troops causing trouble in the countryside, groups that are not clearly part of any official army. Where do such bands come from? Often from the margins, displaced soldiers whose pay is in arrears, retainers of a defeated noble, men whose fields have failed one time too many. Instead of starving quietly, they pick up their weapons and go looking for another way to eat. This is how raiding economies begin to proliferate. Rather than producing grain, you take grain. Rather than mining copper, you hijack the caravans carrying it. Instead of waiting for the palace to assign you rations, you cut out the middleman and loot a warehouse, a temple, an unwalled town. Mercenaries thrive in this environment. Palaces that still have something left to protect hire fighters from outside their own tax base. These men might be foreign specialists in a particular kind of warfare, or simply locals with nothing left to lose. Either way, their loyalty is tied to pay. If the pay stops, their swords do not disappear. They just look for a new employer, or a new target. We catch glimpses of such people in the records, Sheridan and other sea peoples fighting both against and for Egypt, contingents of foreign spearmen in Near Eastern armies, personal guard units around kings that are explicitly not drawn from the local population. Archaeology shows another side of the same story, a defensive building boom. In the century or so before and during the collapse, many sites across the eastern Mediterranean see hurried fortification projects. Walls are thickened, new ramparts go up, older citadels are repaired in a rough, rushed style. In some places, small hilltop refuges are suddenly occupied and ringed with hastily built defences. You do not invest precious labour in walls unless you are afraid. These constructions are not always the grand, carefully planned fortifications of a confident power projecting strength. Sometimes they look like patch jobs, as if someone realised very late that danger was closer than expected. Bastions jut out at odd angles. Gates are choked with extra structures. Space inside the walls fills with cramped, improvised housing. Fear, once it settles in, does not stay neatly outside the palace. As the external world grows more threatening, palace politics tend to grow sharper. When resources shrink, factions inside the court compete more bitterly over what remains. Rival princes, military commanders, high priests, and powerful officials all have different ideas about how to respond, and each has clients and supporters in the wider society. Internal coups and factional violence become more likely. We have at least a few clear examples from this era of kings being overthrown by their brothers, generals seizing power, royal families wiped out and replaced by new dynasties. In other cases, the evidence is more circumstantial. Sudden changes in royal names, abrupt shifts in administrative style, or layers of destruction within palaces that seem more consistent with looting and arson from within than with an orderly enemy siege from without. Imagine a palace already strained by drought, debt, earthquakes and raiders. Now imagine that, in the middle of this, the king is assassinated, or a succession dispute erupts. Different factions seize parts of the palace complex. Archives burn, not because a foreign army stormed the gate, but because someone inside wanted to erase the old records, or simply did not care if the files survived while they grabbed the gold. From the outside, the result looks similar: a ruined palace, a burned archive, a broken dynasty. But the cause is internal as much as external. The system is devouring itself. This is where the idea of collapse needs to be handled carefully. It is easy to picture the late Bronze Age ending in simple battlefield defeat. Mighty kingdoms toppled because their armies lost a series of big set-piece wars. There were battles, of course. Some were probably decisive for individual cities and dynasties. But what really seems to fail across region after region is not just armies. It is administration. Palaces stop functioning as coordinating hubs. The scribal schools that trained the bureaucrats falter. Tax lists are no longer compiled, or, if they are, they no longer result in grain actually reaching the storerooms. Orders go out and are not obeyed. Vassal kings stop sending their tribute. Temples no longer receive regular offerings from the centre. You can see this loss of administrative capacity in the archaeology. Fewer standardized weights and measures, fewer seal impressions on storage jars, fewer written documents, less evidence of centralized redistribution. A city might still be standing. People might still be living in it. But if the palace at its heart can no longer collect, store and reallocate resources, can no longer organize work crews or muster troops, then, in the terms of that age, it has already collapsed. War, revolt, raids, coups, these are the visible symptoms of a deeper breakdown. They are what happens when stressed systems try to protect themselves by squeezing harder, and the people being squeezed begin to push back, or simply walk away. When the hammer blows of climate, disaster and external enemies fall on palaces, already hollowed out by debt, fear and internal conflict, the result is not just a series of lost battles. It is a world in which the very idea of palace power stops working. So what do you call it when everything fails at once, but nothing fails for the same reason? Historians have started to use a phrase borrowed from ecology and engineering: systems collapse. Not a single shattering blow, not one villain that you can point to in the dock and say, there. That's what ended the Bronze Age. Instead, a stack of pressures, layered over time, nudging complex societies closer and closer to the edge, until one more shock, any shock, is enough to push them past a point of no return. Imagine taking everything we've talked about and laying it on a table. Long-term drought slowly lowering the water in the cisterns and the patience of farmers. Earthquakes snapping walls and aqueducts that nobody quite has the money or manpower to repair properly. Trade routes fraying as pirates, raiders and rival armies make caravans expensive and dangerous. Copper and tin deliveries become uncertain, which means bronze becomes scarce, which means chariots and weapons are harder to maintain. On top of that, palaces leaning harder on their subjects, driving up taxes, driving up debts, driving young men into armies or mercenary bands. Factional struggles inside the court, foreign enemies testing the borders, displaced people on the move by land and by sea, looking for somewhere, anywhere, more secure than the place they left. No single one of these is guaranteed to destroy a civilization. A strong, well-buffered system can ride out quite a lot. That word buffer is one historians and archaeologists use all the time. A buffer might be literal grain in the granaries, 3 bad harvests in a row, and you can still feed the army and the capital. It might be social, alliances and kin networks that can be called on when things go wrong. It might be political, a king who can credibly demand sacrifice now in exchange for security later. It might even be geographic, a kingdom tucked away behind mountains that soften the blow of invasion. Resilience is the name for how much disturbance a system can absorb before it changes into something else. A resilient palace economy might lose a province, rebuild a few walls, tighten belts for a decade, and then go back to something like normal. A less resilient one might look fine on the outside, but have almost no reserves. One drought, one big quake, one failed diplomatic marriage, and the whole structure starts to fall apart. The crucial thing is that resilience is not evenly distributed. Egypt, with its river and deep administrative traditions, bends under stress but does not quite break. The Hittite Empire, landlocked, racked by internal rivalries, squeezed between enemies, reaches its tipping point faster. Mycenaean Greece, a patchwork of competing palatial centres rather than a single unified kingdom, fragments in its own distinctive way, some citadels burning, others slowly shrinking, local elites morphing into something new. From a distance it looks synchronous. 1177 BC, everything collapses. Up close, it is more like watching different branches of the same tree snap in a storm, one after another, each at its own weak point, each under slightly different pressures. Part of why the mystery persists is that we are piecing this together from broken fragments. The people living through the late Bronze Age collapse did not issue a neat final report. We have no universal chronicle saying, in year X, drought began. In year Y, raiders arrived. In year Z, the palace fell. What we have instead are scattered letters, partial king lists, myths edited centuries later, and layers of ash and rubble in the ground. The written sources we do have are biased by design. Royal inscriptions emphasize victories and downplay defeats. Egyptian reliefs turn chaotic wars and migrations into tidy stories of heroic pharaohs smiting foreign enemies. Administrative tablets complain about missing shipments or troublesome troops, but almost never admit, we have lost control of the countryside and do not know what we're doing. Even dating the collapse is hard. Radiocarbon samples have margins of error. Pottery styles shift gradually, not on a single day. A destruction layer in one site might be 30 years earlier or later than a destruction layer at another site, even if both get rounded in modern books to around 1200 BC. When your time resolution is measured in decades, separate events blur together. All of this leaves space for argument. One scholar looks at the evidence and emphasizes climate. Another points to earthquakes. Another sees the decisive factor in invasions or internal revolt. Each can marshal plausible data. Each is probably touching one part of a much bigger animal. The safest conclusion may be the least satisfying. There was no single culprit. Instead, there was a tightly interconnected world already operating near its limits, facing a cluster of shocks that landed within a relatively short span of time. In some places, climate or famine may have been the decisive push. In others, war or internal politics did the final damage. Often they work together. The complexity is not a problem to be explained away. It is the point. When you build systems that are powerful but brittle, that concentrate resources and decisions in a few palaces, that depend on long, vulnerable supply chains and delicate diplomatic balances, you also create the conditions for a particular kind of failure. Not a single spectacular blow, but a grinding, uneven unravelling. And out of that unravelling, something new would eventually emerge. When we say collapse, it's easy to imagine an empty map. Palaces gone, cities burned, and then nothing. Silence. A blank stretch of centuries until some new king or empire marches back onto the stage and starts writing things down again. But the land itself never goes quiet. People do not vanish just because the archives do. If you could walk through the eastern Mediterranean in the centuries after 1177 BC, you would not find a lifeless wasteland. You would find something messier and more ordinary. Fields still being ploughed, sheep still being herded, pots still being fired. You would hear children and arguments and prayers. What's changed is the shape of power and the way that life is organised on the ground. In the late Bronze Age, much of the region was dominated by big, centralised palatial states. One main centre, maybe a handful sucked in surplus from hundreds of villages, stored it, redistributed it, and wrote everything down on clay or papyrus. In the early Iron Age, that pyramid flattens. Grandeur shrinks. Instead of great empires like Hatti or mighty networks of Mycenaean palaces, we see a patchwork of much smaller polities. Little kingdoms, city-states, local chieftains with a few hilltop strongholds rather than a sprawling bureaucracy and diplomatic ties to 5 different courts. Archaeologists notice this first in the settlement patterns. Big, heavily fortified palaces often lie in ruins, their upper stories collapsed, their storerooms abandoned. But out in the countryside, new sites appear. Hilltops and ridges that had been empty in the palatial period suddenly sprout small villages, clusters of simple houses, built with more concern for defence and visibility than for access to royal roads. Coastal cities that once served as hubs in a vast trade web may contract dramatically or even vanish, while in the highlands above them, new communities take root. In Greece, the population seems to redistribute: fewer rich graves, fewer luxury imports, more modest farmsteads scattered across landscapes that had once been tightly controlled by palace officials. Long-distance trade doesn't disappear, but it thins out and becomes riskier. Those old dependable convoys of copper and tin, lumber and luxury goods, backed by treaties and royal guarantees, are mostly gone. Instead, you get shorter, more improvised connections, coastal hopping from bay to bay, overland caravans that operate on a smaller scale, merchants who are more opportunists than state employees. If Bronze Age trade was like a well-maintained highway system, the early Iron Age is more like a network of back roads and footpaths. People still move, goods still move, but fewer things cross thousands of kilometres. Fewer palaces can count on overseas shipments arriving on time. Out of this leaner, more localised world, a strange new metal slowly steps into the foreground. Iron. It had been known before. Hittite texts mention it. A few rare iron objects, often meteoric, literally from the sky, turn up in earlier burials, treated like curiosities or status symbols. But in the old system, bronze was king. Copper plus tin smelted and alloyed in specialist centres, shipped along those famous trade routes, turned into tools and weapons at palatial workshops. When those routes fray and those palaces topple, bronze becomes harder to organise. You can't command tin from a distant mountain range if you no longer control the coast, or if the people in the middle have other priorities. Copper might still be there, but without tin, it's just copper. Iron has a different logic. Iron ore is more widely available than tin. Lots of regions have some. The problem in the late Bronze Age was not that people didn't know iron existed, it was that working it well was difficult and not yet worth the investment when bronze was already embedded in the system. Smelting iron requires higher temperatures and more careful control. Early iron is often brittle, full of impurities. Making a reliable iron tool isn't just a matter of switching ores, it demands new techniques, more trial and error, more experimentation in countless smoky village furnaces. The collapse of the old order creates both the need and the room for that experimentation. With bronze supplies irregular, communities that can't easily import metal have strong incentives to tinker with what's available locally. Over generations, blacksmiths refine their methods. Better furnaces, repeated heating and hammering to drive out slag, quenching and reheating to change the metal's structure. The result is not an overnight technological revolution, but a slow gradient. For a long time, bronze and iron coexist. In some places, bronze remains the preferred material for certain objects, especially where elites can still command tin. In others, iron appears first in cheap tools or simple knives, gradually moving into spearheads, then swords as techniques improve. In some regions, you can actually watch the transition in grave goods and hoards. A few tentative iron pieces among a majority of bronze, then a more even mix, then mostly iron with bronze surviving for special uses or decorative fittings. Bronze Age and Iron Age are convenient labels, but on the ground they blur into each other. The same is true of culture more broadly. We sometimes talk about a dark age after the late Bronze Age collapse, especially in Greece. But dark here mostly means dark to us. Fewer written texts, fewer monumental inscriptions, fewer obvious royal archives to guide our reconstructions. For the people living through it, this was not a time without memory. Languages don't stop being spoken because nobody is carving them into stone. Religious practices don't vanish just because temples are no longer sheathed in imported cedar and gold. Stories don't cease to be told because scribes have fewer tablets to write on. Instead, much of culture moves more fully into the oral realm. Myths, genealogies, heroic tales, laments for fallen cities. All the things that had once been written down for palace audiences continue to circulate by word of mouth. Some of them change in the retelling, grow new details, adapt to new circumstances. Others crystallize into traditions that will later be written down in entirely new political contexts. The gods change costumes, but not always identities. A storm god who had once received offerings in a Hittite sanctuary may reappear, centuries later, in the pantheon of a small Neo-Hittite city-state, still associated with thunder and kingship, but now flanked by new local companions. Deities in the Levant shift names, blend together, or split apart, yet remain recognizably tied to older cults when you follow their attributes and iconography. Art follows a similar path of continuity and reinvention. The grand, polished reliefs of imperial courts give way to rougher, smaller-scale objects, locally carved seals, painted pottery, bronze figurines. Motifs migrate. A style that used to belong to a collapsed kingdom might be picked up and reinterpreted by its neighbours. Warriors, chariots, ships, and hybrid creatures all survive in miniature, even as the palaces that once commissioned them crumble. And in the middle of this, new identities begin to take shape. When large empires and royal systems fall, they leave behind populations who still need some way to organise allegiance, who we are and who they are. In the early Iron Age, we start to see the first clear traces of groups that will loom large in later stories. Small Aramaean states in Syria, early Philistine cities in the southern coastal Levant, emerging Israelite and other highland communities in the interior, Phoenician ports rebuilding their maritime networks. These are not created from nothing. They draw on existing languages, older population mixes, deep local traditions. But the fragmented political landscape, no single, overwhelming Hittite empire, no stable Mycenaean network gives them room to assert themselves, to define their own styles of pottery, their own architectural habits, their own ways of telling their past. Small polities can be surprisingly inventive. Without the heavy overhead of a massive palace bureaucracy, communities can experiment with new forms of governance and alliance. City-states negotiate with their neighbours. Tribal confederations try out looser, more flexible structures. Local elites sponsor shrines, markets, and eventually new kinds of writing and record-keeping suited to their own scale. From a distance with few texts and no grand monuments, this can look like a long lull between civilized peaks. Up close, it is more like watching a forest regrow after a fire. The old canopy of empires is gone. Sunlight reaches the ground. Many seedlings fail. Some linger as shrubs. A few eventually grow into the next generation of towering trees. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Phoenician trading networks, the small Iron Age states that will later be swallowed into Assyria, Babylon and Persia. Calling the centuries after 1177 BC, a dark age hides as much as it reveals. Yes, our evidence is dimmer. The written record thins out. Dates are less precise. More of what happened has to be inferred from pottery shards, carbon samples, and the layout of ruined villages instead of neatly dated inscriptions. But dim to historians is not the same thing as dim to the people who lived then. They were still thinking, adapting, remembering, improvising, taking inherited languages and gods and stories, and weaving them into something new in the shadow of fallen palaces. The late Bronze Age world had collapsed as a system. Its palatial highways and diplomatic protocols, its tight dependence on bronze and long-distance trade, had reached their limits. What grew in its place was rougher, more local, and in some ways more resilient. And from those scattered villages and small hilltop strongholds, the next great chapter of ancient history was quietly beginning to assemble itself. When we look back at 1177 BC, it's tempting to hunt for a single villain. A year, a battle, a group of invaders with strange helmets. A volcano, a drought index, a smoking gun on a broken tablet. But the deeper you go into the evidence, the less satisfying that kind of answer becomes. The same years that give us burned palaces also give us letters about grain shortages and shipping delays and runaway workers. The layers that show destruction from earthquakes sit right next to evidence for long grinding decline, Shipwrecks full of mixed cargo tell us trade was still happening even as some ports were failing. Drought reconstructions line up with famine texts, but not every region is hit the same way or at the same time. Nothing moves in lockstep. Nothing collapses for just one reason. What does fit is a picture of multiple stresses piling up on a tightly connected system until that system can no longer absorb them. Climate shifts that make harvests unreliable, earthquakes that damage key hubs, wars that drain resources, refugees on the move, elites clinging to old ways of doing things while the world beneath them quietly changes. Networks stretched so thin that when one node fails, the effects ripple farther than anyone expects. A system's collapse, not a single catastrophe. And inside that abstract phrase, systems collapse, there are lives. Families in coastal cities watching foreign ships appear on the horizon, and not knowing whether they mean trade or violence this time. Farmers in the interior hearing fewer messengers from the palace, and realizing that this year they may be on their own. Scribes writing desperate letters for grain relief, wondering if anyone is still out there to read them. People choosing whether to stay in a place that feels increasingly unsafe or to pack what they can carry and climb into the hills. For some, collapse means losing status and security. No more rations stamped with the king's seal. No more bronze from distant mines. No more certainty that someone, somewhere, is keeping the records straight. For others, it might mean opportunity, land no longer measured and taxed so precisely. Local leaders who suddenly matter more than faraway great kings. The archaeology we sift through, ash layers, abandoned buildings, reused tombs, new little villages on old empty ridges, is really a record of all those quiet decisions made under pressure. Insecurity, movement, adaptation. That is why this collapse still matters. Not because it marks the end of civilization, but because it shows how a complex, globalized world can be both powerful and fragile at the same time. How prosperity built on long, delicate chains of dependence can unravel when too many links fray at once. How ordinary people find ways to keep going when the big structures they relied on falter. It's also a reminder that an ending from one point of view is a beginning from another. If you could drift above the eastern Mediterranean in the decades after 1177 BC, you would see smoke rising from ruined palaces and also from new hearths in new houses. You would see toppled walls and freshly ploughed terraces, abandoned ports, and small boats still hugging the coast, shrines roofless and empty, and other shrines, simpler, poorer, flickering back to life. The world is not ending, it is resetting. The rules of power are being redrawn. Old stories are being retold in new accents. Children are growing up who will have no memory of the great courts of Hatti or the long lists of Mycenaean kings. For them, the patchwork Iron Age landscape will be normal, the baseline from which new empires will one day rise. We live in a connected world too. We depend on long supply chains and delicate infrastructures, on distant resources and invisible agreements. Studying 1177 BC doesn't give us a prophecy, but it does give us a sense of how complicated systems fail, and how, even in the middle of that failure, people adapt, improvise and preserve more than we might think. Somewhere in every age, someone is keeping a story alive while the palace burns. If you've stayed with this story through the night, let it settle in your mind as you drift towards sleep, not as a tale of sudden annihilation, but as a slow, uneven turning of the wheel, a forest after fire, a shoreline after the tide has gone out, leaving space for new things to take root. When you wake, those palaces will still be ruins, their tablets still broken. But the people who walked away from them will still be there too, somewhere in the dust of the record, carrying their languages, their gods, and their memories forward. If you found this journey through the late Bronze Age calming or thought-provoking, you can help this channel grow by liking this video, subscribing, and leaving a comment. I'd especially love to hear where you're listening from. what country, what city, what little corner of the world you're in right now. So, before you close your eyes, tell me in the comments where you are and we'll let the ruins rest together for the night.